It's very easy to take for granted some of the simple things in life. Many times it's things that you don't even notice until you notice them. One of those things, if you're lucky, is the stability of the world around you. For most of us, this is probably a little bit of a strange thing to think about, but what would you do if overnight you belonged to a completely different country? For most of us that grew up in the United States, it's almost unthinkable that we wouldn't always be American. But it wasn't this way for many, many, many people over the course of history. You could go to bed one night identifying with a certain tribe and wake up the next day belonging to another. Empires rise and fall, kingdoms come and go, wars are won and lost, and that transitional aspect of it is always going to be interesting on a personal level. How would that situation change the way you lived? How would that change the person you are and how you think about yourself? These are complicated questions of group and individual identity. What it means to belong to a group or a country or a tribe is obviously something that has always been a part of history, and people have always had to negotiate that. But it seems like this topic has been brought up even more in the modern political landscape. And to me, where it becomes interesting is when you've built up these identities and these traditions, and they're baked into the consciousness of who you are. What happens when suddenly your enemy is no longer your enemy? Historian, ethnographer, and anthropologist Daphne Berdahl, as we discussed in the last episode, was in the East German town of Kella from about December 1990 to August of 1992. And what she discovered was that people's identities in this border town were tied up in all sorts of things, from the secrecy of politics in the communist society to the role of religion in people's everyday lives. And as we continue to analyze identity in this particular episode, what she found was that the economics of the situation in East Germany also impacted people's identity and the way they thought about themselves on a day-to-day basis. The town of Kella in East Germany was a town just like any other before World War II. Class organization was based mainly on property. Large landowners controlled certain elements of the economy in the village and enjoyed a higher social status. But after the war, when a lot of these large landowners were fleeing or had their farms forced into the collectivized farms of the socialist regime, class became more about what we call social capital. So this basically means the kinds of connections that you had with other people and how you were able to display these connections to the people in the village. So in a communist society, it becomes less about wealth accumulation in terms of money or property or things like that. Obviously, property more or less is abolished in the socialist system in East Germany, but your wealth is based on all sorts of different factors now, not just property or money. The villagers in Kella were conflicted with this new economic system. Here's one villager remembering what her neighbor felt like when he discovered that all these large landowners and even small landowners were being absorbed into this big collective farm situation. She says, quote, "What a drama that was with our neighbor. He had a very small farm, and he didn't want to join the collective. They came to his courtyard where there was a chopping block and an axe next to it. He threw his head down on the block and yelled, "Here, just chop off my head. I don't want to live anymore. They want to take away everything I've built up." End quote. Obviously, people who worked hard for what they have earned in life were upset with that being taken away, redistributed. But there were also villagers who didn't mind it so much. Some people enjoyed the fact that they probably didn't need to work as much. Other people enjoyed the community aspect of the collective, being able to meet with other people in other villages. Here's what Daphne Berdahl says about that, quote, "Collective work is often fondly remembered as an easier way of earning livestock feed, as well as a way of becoming acquainted with people from neighboring villages who worked for the same regional farm." End quote. Obviously, a move to socialism like this is going to be controversial among the people. Some people hated it, some people liked it, some people didn't mind it so much. And leaving aside the economic effects of all of those policies, what ended up happening was that no matter how you shake it out, private property was no longer a form of economic capital, economic wealth. So people had to find other ways to form social distinctions, and there was other ways where class and hierarchy presented themselves. So like that villager said, the sense of community that the socialist system brought out, a lot of villagers remember that as being much more important to everybody than after the reunification, when the market economy and consumerism kind of took over. And given that the sense of community was more important during that time period, it also makes sense that people's role in the community would be how they distinguish themselves. In many people's estimation, the goal of communism is to eliminate these class distinctions, but on a practical level in the GDR, that's not really what happened. So there were different ways to move up or down the ladder. And in a human society, human nature would dictate that there's always going to be some kind of hierarchy or distinction. So one way to kind of rise up in the ranks was to join the party. Party members had advantages from an economic perspective as far as getting rations and supplies and quotas from the state. They had a better opportunity to do that. Building permits were actually difficult to obtain and one of the things that were most prized, and those went to party members first. In addition to being a party member or not being a party member, you could also acquire what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called social capital. According to Bourdieu, social capital is, quote, "the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition." End quote. Gotta love that academic speak there, where you have to read the sentence 8 times to figure out what the heck this person just said, possibly to inflate their own academic ego with the use of big words. But anyway, what he's saying there is that the connections you make with other people become important, and they become the source of wealth in the society, really. So if you're able to make connections with all sorts of different people, that gives you a lot of avenues to operate in the socialist economy. The key thing to understand here is that the economy in East Germany was an economy of scarcity, in part because of the collectivization, in part because of the redistribution, the elimination of class, the abandonment of private property. All of these things combined to make the economy not as efficient as it could be. And this meant that materials, food, clothing, building materials, all of the stuff in the economy was rare. So if you had connections with other people who could get you that stuff, that was more important than having a lot of money. Because if you had a lot of money, but you didn't know the right people in order to get the stuff that's being distributed by the state or businesses run by the state, you're going to be in trouble. Daphne Berdahl calls this the second economy, and it was the main way that people acquired scarce materials, consumer goods, and resources in the economy of Kela. The more connections you had, the better off you were going to be. Historian Catherine Verdery writes that this system of economic organization is actually going to make things worse and more inefficient because it's going to encourage corruption. So the people in the village would call it having a connection with somebody, but in the grand scheme of things, she writes that there would be, quote, whole networks of cozy relations among economic managers and their bureaucratic clerks and their customers, end quote. She says that it would encourage hoarding materials, hiding materials, only giving materials to people you know, or bartering, accepting bribes, these types of things that in general weren't going to be good for the collective. An example of this would be, say that your car broke down and you needed an auto mechanic, but you didn't have enough connections where you directly knew one, so you go to, say, your friend who you've maintained a good connection with, and that person has a good relationship with the grocery store owner who has a good relationship with somebody else who knows the auto mechanic. So a couple of gifts here, a couple of gifts there, a bribe here, a bribe there. You might go to your friend who's going to go to his friend who goes to the grocery store clerk who goes to his friend who ultimately goes to the auto mechanic. So the bigger your network is, then the more opportunity you're going to have access to resources in the economy. In Kela and in many places in East Germany and socialist societies, gift giving and bribes became very important, as well as other forms of bartering. So it was very important that when you give a gift, you kind of expect to receive one in return, and when you receive a gift, you certainly make a note to give one back in order to maintain or even to establish a new relationship. One woman in the village puts it pretty well when she says, quote, "You always remembered the repairman's birthday or the electrician's son's first communion. So they would be there if you needed them. Money actually did help you. It helped maintain the connections, but the connections were most important." End quote. Having connections was critical to being able to survive in the socialist economy. Another method was just simply hoarding things. So they were called hamster purchases, but if you could have the opportunity to get a bulk order of something, or a large order, whatever it might be, it could be tiles or towels or porcelain, whatever, you got it and then you hoarded it and then you would slowly trade it away. The problem came when those items went out of fashion, or you couldn't get rid of them, or you didn't have the connection to get rid of them. That's going to be bad for you. So this is kind of how the goods and the materials and the consumer items circulated, and you can see how there's a strategic element of social life and how the social life is connected to the economy. If you had a nice house with fresh trim and good tile and white paint and good furnishing and a nice garden, it was thought that you were socially wealthy, not necessarily economically wealthy. I think it's also interesting to note that a lot of times Western goods and Western luxury items were seen as exotic, and these could boost your prestige and oftentimes even make a political statement. Interestingly, when the Berlin Wall fell and shortly thereafter when Germany was reunified, the sense of community began to dwindle. And it makes sense because the connections and that second economy, the social capital that we talked about, that aspect of things fell apart very quickly. Now connections don't matter anymore. It's more of a market economy based on price and brand, and you don't really need those connections in order to make purchases or make trades. And suddenly that's going to change the economy, and it's also going to change the way people look at themselves and at the community, because there's no longer that strategic sense of community anymore. There's no longer that connection between the community and the economy. Wealth now becomes a bigger factor. There's different ranges of success that people can have, which potentially could breed discomfort in the community. Many people were upset when they saw divisions in the community that, from some of their perspectives, was a result of the rising consumerism and market economy. One villager said, quote, "The togetherness, it's not what it used to be. I miss that." End quote. Another person said, quote, "But now when one of us earns 19 marks and the other only 8 marks an hour, there are problems." End quote. One woman that Daphne Berdahl quotes says, quote, "Envy is really bad now. All the couples in our clique had about the same. They earned the same, they had the same furniture, etc. Now I feel as if people resent us because we're doing so well." End quote. Another person says, quote, "I never thought it would happen to our clique. I've watched it happen to others. Nobody gets together anymore. But I didn't think it would happen to us. But look, it has." End quote. Berdahl makes the argument here that the disappearance of the social network, the second economy, that social capital, leads to a declining sense of community. The people in the town no longer have that sense of community that they have, even if they now have better access to goods and overall probably a better, stronger economy. Once the wall fell and the border was gone, in addition to a dwindling sense of community amongst many villagers, there was also other ways that people's identity seemed to shift or morph in the next couple of years. You can really see this in the writings of some of the first people that crossed the border from east to west. So you have to remember that this was a border that had been in place for almost 5 decades, and this was not something you crossed or really even think about crossing unless you were willing to risk your life for it, at least for a large period of life in Kella and the GDR. One of the first things that the West German government did was, for the people of Kella who were crossing over in the days after Germany was reunified, they offered 100 marks as kind of a gift to the first-time border crossers. And in many cases, other just random people in West Germany would add on to this and just give people money, give East German people money as they were coming across the border. And while this seems like a nice act of charity and in general a good thing, it was very conflicting for a lot of people in East Germany, because on the one hand, they did want to be part of some of the good things in West Germany and explore the consumer goods and some of the different things that they've heard about. And on the other hand, they don't want to just totally discard their previous life. Here's what one person says in November of 1989, shortly after the wall fell, on his first visit to West Germany, quote, "But I didn't want to go right away. To be honest, I was scared to see everything. And I was totally irritated at how everyone was after the 100 Western marks. It's humiliating to get rich from your tax money. If we could at least have exchanged for it, maybe the West Germans will destroy the GDR this way. It's like an investment. They buy the GDR citizens their sympathy, and then they won't want to remain GDR citizens anymore." End quote. So GDR is just German Democratic Republic, short for East Germany, and what he's saying there is that while in general people are pretty happy about the reunification of Germany, there's these complicated issues of West Germans and maybe the capitalist system kind of declaring victory on East Germans. And the expectation becomes that East Germans are just simply going to assimilate into West German society. Historian John Bornemann kind of articulates this very thought process when he talks about the days after the border was opened. So here he says, quote, "In the days and weeks after the opening, East Germans gorged themselves on the symbolic goods of West German nationness. They flocked to the shopping centers and stores in a consumptive orgy that kept West German businesses open long after the state-mandated closing hours. And they sought those items that most define the West German self: cars, indexing power and prosperity; pornography, symbolizing pleasure and free time; travel out of their country; genes of the sort identifying one as Western," end quote. So there's this kind of meme of the Cold War ending, the Berlin Wall falling, and like this historian is saying, the East Germaners being liberated and rushing into the West and going on these shopping sprees and just gorging themselves on the wonderful market economy. And while there are certainly some nuggets of truth there, East Germans loved going shopping. That was one of the first things they were able to do. Keep in mind, they weren't really able to do that for decades. It was not an economy where they were able to pick and choose between different brands. They had to pretty much scratch and claw for what they could get. But it does seem a little exaggerated. And when you listen to the accounts in Daphne Berdahl's book and you read about what the actual people in Kella were saying about this transition, a lot of them were hesitant. They didn't want to appear needy, or they didn't want to immediately abandon their culture. They didn't want to immediately abandon their tradition, and they wanted to find a way to assimilate while also maintaining their own sense of dignity and tradition. After the wall fell and reunification happened, there was certainly this initial period where there was a lot of jubilation and happiness and good spirits between the assimilated East Germans and West Germans. But in the years and months afterwards, problems began to arise. And in particular, these problems were problems that challenged the identity of the people from Kella, challenging who they were as people. Here's what Daphne Berdahl says in her book, Where the World Ended, talking about this period after the wall had fell, people had been reunited for a little while, and now there's these kind of problems surfacing. Quote, "A host of legal, political, and discursive practices reflected a systematic devaluation of the East German past that challenged some of the very foundations of Easterners' identity and personhood. Such practices including the selling of East German factories to Western companies, occasionally for next to nothing, the discrediting of the East German educational system, particularly the restructuring of the universities, the renaming of schools, streets, and other public buildings, the removal of socialist memorials and monuments, the trial of Berlin border guards, the dissolution of East German media such as local newspapers and the television station, DFF, the restructuring and rebuilding of urban and rural spaces following Western models, and comparisons in dominant West German discourses of the socialist state with the Nazi regime," end quote. You get the sense that it's going to be one of these questions of, okay, it seems like the Soviet Union has collapsed and East Germany is done. Now, how are we going to remember it? Is this going to be portrayed as a conquest, or is this going to be portrayed more as an assimilation? So when East Germaners started seeing their schools renamed and some of these monuments getting torn down and putting border guards on trial, things like this, these are very challenging to people's identities. You can't help but, in the modern day, think about the controversy over the Confederate memorials in the American South. Some people saying rip them down, some people saying keep them up, some people saying put them in museums, and it's all very divisive and charged. you get the similar feeling that something like that was playing out here in relation to East Germany and West Germany being reunified. One villager said, quote, "Are we supposed to say now that everyone who went to school in East Germany was an idiot, or that all the factories in East Germany were just deadbeats? It's simply not true," end quote. You can start to see how this reunification is going to be a lot more complicated than simply declaring victory and assuming that everyone's just going to be on board when you hear quotes like that. To me, this is because identity is complex. And when two cultures meet at a borderland, and when a border literally disappears, it's not just one side absorbing and assimilating the other completely. Oftentimes there's sort of a mechanism where both sides do things to maintain their memories, maintain their nostalgia, and both sides kind of play off of each other. So while Easterners were getting used to advertising and door-to-door salesmen and mail-order gimmicks and pyramid schemes and educational lectures trying to sell you stuff, they were learning about some of the, I would say, negatives of the market economy that Westerners had been dealing with for a long time, and they were absorbing this into their worldview and adjusting, and that took a while. So it wasn't just East German people flocking over to the West and immediately absorbing every ideological detail and every opportunity to be Western, and they're also not just simply rejecting everything Western and maintaining their Eastern ideology. It's a combination, it's a mix of both. Here's what Daphne Berdahl argues, quote, "Contrary to certain border theories, then, residents of Kella are not halfway beings, nor are they, as many popular and academic discourses would have it, passive East Germans who have accepted and internalized Western projections of them as inferior. Instead, through a dynamic and subtle interplay of imitation, resistance, and one's own sense or one's own meaning, these borderliners are creating and articulating new forms of identity and alternative notions of Germanness," end quote. Oftentimes the people of Kella would appreciate being able to participate in consumerism and go shopping and check out all the different brands of items and stuff, and they would enjoy this, but also find a way to differentiate and maintain that Eastern identity, whether it be through the way they dressed or the cars they bought or decisions to work for less money in the East just to be with that sense of Eastern pride. These people were trying to carve their own identity into this reunification situation. Women in particular had a difficult time transitioning because under the socialist regime, pretty much all of them were working. About 99% of women in Kella were employed, and this was essentially state mandated. They worked in factories. They built up a better sense of community with the other women in the factory. As we talked about before, the workplace was essentially a state-controlled operation. So the community was there, the family was there, daycare was at the factory. So it's kind of a clever move by the regime to make it so that everything you needed was at the factory. Daycare, doctors, kitchen, all that stuff was there, so it makes the state a part of everyday life. And it makes community an especially important part of life. And in particular for women, they had what was called a double or triple burden. So they had to be what was known as worker mothers, where they go out and work in the factories, but they also had to take care of traditional gender roles that were still being upheld in some places by the church and by the state, where they were in charge of the domestic sphere as well. Here's what one woman said about the double burden of women in the socialist regime, quote, "Women had a say here in politics and in work. Women here had to do as much as men and more. They worked 8 hours and then came home and kept working," end quote. When Germany was reunified, a lot of women were disillusioned because many were relegated back to the domestic sphere. A lot of the factories closed. Women were let go from other factories, often as the first cuts made when it was time to make difficult employment decisions. Political participation fell due to the lack of women's groups and community gatherings that women often took part of in the socialist era. Questions in the popular discourse about whether or not women being in the workforce is good or bad for the family. This was something that was debated pretty heatedly after reunification in Germany in the 90s. You add in the role of consumerism and the opportunity for new hobbies and shopping and things like this, and you can see how identity becomes more complicated in this period after reunification. People's lives are changing in dramatic ways, and they're going to have to adjust the way they think about themselves in relation to the world. And like we said earlier, while all these changes are happening, people are constantly in the process of being in this strange position where they have to choose what to remember and what to forget. The people of Germany had to decide, how should we remember the East German past? Can we separate it from Stalin and the Soviet Union and his policies? What, if any, comparisons to the Nazi regime should be made? Should we get rid of some of these socialist monuments? Should we rename the schools and the streets? Should we even tear down the border fence, or should we leave it up as a symbol of what happened after World War II? People were debating how this should be taught in the classrooms. The importance of history here can't be understated because, as one of these historians who was taking part in this argument in Germany over how should this be remembered, it was actually called the historians' debate. One of them said, quote, "This is no academic question. He who determines what was also determines what will be." If it was me, I would add on to that, he who forgets what was is going to regret what will be. I remember reading a Washington Post article a little while ago titled, "Germany Reunified 26 Years Ago, but Some Divisions Are Still Strong." The article is a couple of years old, but it pointed out that on a number of important issues and key indicators, Germany is still very much divided. There's a lot of divides between East and West Germany, and there's a lot of tension there over a number of issues. Immigration, obviously, at the top of the list in Europe at the moment. Some people attribute the rise of extreme right-wing politics to the way that some of this social, economic, and political divisions that go all the way back to West Germany and East Germany, how they still matter today, and how these issues can be used for understanding, but also for exploitation. And only time will tell how that turns out. I've been trying to show that how people remember the past plays a role in how they view themselves. And of course, how people view themselves plays a role in everything that we care about, from a personal level all the way to the level of governments and politics and foreign affairs. As we've established here in this episode, identity is complex and it involves all sorts of different things: memory, nostalgia, tradition, respect, finding a way to be different and be an individual while also being part of a group. And in many ways, identity is the memories that you have and how you act on them. And if what makes you who you are, what makes you you, is remembering, then there are few disciplines more important than the study of history.